Welcome to the Quiet Strength Podcast, Fathers in a Failing World. I'm Giacomo Knox. We live in a time when the role of fathers is often misunderstood, sometimes ignored, and occasionally even ridiculed. Yet throughout history, strong fathers, sometimes loud but often quiet, have held families, communities, and entire civilizations together. This podcast explores that quiet strength. Each episode brings together thoughtful conversations about fatherhood, responsibility, faith, forgiveness, and the challenges men face in raising the next generation. Some of these conversations are inspired by research, history, and emerging technology that helps us explore important new ideas in new ways. This is an independent production, built by people who believe that strong families and strong fathers still matter. As the show grows, we are always interested in connecting with organizations and partners who want to help us support meaningful conversations about fatherhood and legacy. But at the heart of every episode is a simple question. What does it mean to be a good father in a world that sometimes feels like it's falling apart? This is the Quiet Strength Podcast. Let's begin.
If you look across the entire mammalian kingdom, the idea of a father sticking around to help raise his offspring is actually this massive biological anomaly.
Yeah, it's incredibly rare.
It happens in like less than 5% of all mammalian species.
Right. Which is wild when you think about it.
It really is. For the vast majority of mammals out there, the father's biological imperative just sort of ends at conception.
Mm-hmm.
Yet in humans, not only do fathers often stick around, but the sheer act of playing with their toddlers literally rewires their brain chemistry.
It physically changes them.
Exactly. So today on the Deep Dive, we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of research to figure out how this works. We've got neurobiological data from the Ruth Feldman lab on the paternal brain.
Which is groundbreaking stuff, really.
Oh, absolutely. We're also looking at some deep psychological frameworks on the concept of the father wound, a really comprehensive thesis out of Suffolk University on how generational trauma alters parenting, and an article on tending to those male wounds.
It's a profound intersection of biology and culture. You know, we tend to view caregiving as this soft, purely emotional concept.
Right.
But the research shows it's actually a rigorous physical process. It shapes our neurobiology, it dictates how we process stress, and ultimately it determines whether we pass our unhealed wounds down to the next generation.
Which is exactly why we are tracking this all the way from the microscopic level of brain hormones to the way ancient cultures used fairy tales to process family trauma.
Yeah.
We want you, listening to this right now, to understand how a caregiver's presence or their absence leaves an actual physical imprint on you.
Exactly.
So let's start with that biological anomaly. If a mother's brain is flooded with hormones from the physical act of pregnancy and childbirth, nature is basically forcing her into a caregiving mode, right?
Right. It's a completely automatic process.
It's hardwired, but a father is biologically on the outside looking in. They don't give birth. So do their brains just stay static while the mother's brain is reorganizing?
They absolutely do not stay static, provided the father actually engages.
Okay.
The maternal brain relies on what we call bottom-up obligatory pathways. The physical events of pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation trigger these massive hormonal shifts.
Like prolactin and oxytocin.
Exactly. Those surge automatically to prepare the mother for the immense task of keeping an infant alive. But the paternal brain is built top-down.
Top-down, meaning what exactly?
It means it isn't triggered by the biological event of birth. It is triggered entirely by the behavior of active caregiving.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it sounds like the paternal brain is essentially a muscle.
That's a great way to put it.
You don't just magically acquire a dad brain because you provided the genetics. You have to physically put in the reps.
Yeah.
You have to be the one changing the diapers, doing the late night soothing, managing the feeding schedules, all of that, to actually signal to your body that it's time to adapt.
What's fascinating here is that the Feldman Lab research describes this as phenotypic plasticity.
Phenotypic plasticity?
Yeah. It's this brilliant evolutionary workaround. Because the father doesn't have the biological trigger of childbirth, his brain requires a behavior-based pathway to bond.
So the behavior drives the biology.
Exactly. When fathers spend significant time physically caring for their infants, their testosterone levels drop, which makes them less aggressive, and their oxytocin levels rise, which promotes bonding.
Wow.
Their brains literally physically reorganize based on the work they're putting in.
Which was proven in that really compelling brain imaging study mentioned in the research. The one looking at families with two gay fathers.
Oh, that study is incredible.
Right. In these families, the fathers were the primary caregivers from day one, with zero maternal involvement.
And the neuroimaging of those primary caregiving fathers showed something remarkable. The activation in their amygdala, which is the brain's emotion and vigilance center, it perfectly matched the activation levels typically seen in biological mothers.
Wait, really? Just from doing the caregiving work?
Just from the work.
Yeah.
And this heightened amygdala activity was underpinned by connectivity to what researchers call cortical mentalizing networks.
Okay, cortical mentalizing networks, that's a mouthful. Are we basically saying their brains were building new complex pathways to help them, empathize?
Yes, exactly.
Like reading the baby's cues and anticipating what the child needs before the child even cries?
That is the exact translation, yeah. The brain is adapting to fulfill that primary protective and nurturing role. It completely proves that the maternal brain isn't exclusively female.
It's just a primary caregiver brain.
Precisely. If a father, or honestly any secondary caregiver, puts in the intense, repetitive work of primary care, their neurobiology rises to the occasion.
That's amazing.
But the flip side of that phenotypic plasticity is that if a father does not engage in active caregiving, that biological reorganization simply will not happen.
Wow. The biology literally just bypasses them if they don't show up. But if a father's brain goes through all this effort to physically alter its circuitry, the interactions they have with their child must be serving a highly specific evolutionary purpose, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So what is the child actually getting out of this newly wired paternal brain?
Well, the research frames this through three specific tenets of human resilience: plasticity, sociality, and meaning.
Okay.
And fathers, and we're speaking in very broad evolutionary terms here, they often contribute to these tenets through a distinct paternal style of interaction.
How is that different from the maternal style?
Mothers often establish a secure base through face-to-face, predictable, rhythmic bonding. Fathers, however, frequently utilize an outward-facing approach.
Outward-facing.
Yeah. They focus the child's attention not on the parent, but outward toward the environment.
Oh, you're talking about the rough and tumble play?
Exactly.
Tossing the kid in the air, the tickle fights, the sudden, unpredictable movements. It seems like they're safely simulating chaos for the child.
Simulating chaos is a great way to describe it, because think about what happens neurobiologically during a tickle fight, or when a child is tossed in the air.
Their heart rate goes up.
Right. Their heart rate spikes, their arousal levels peak. They're experiencing a huge surge of high energy and slight stress. But because they are being held by a secure, loving caregiver, that stress is immediately buffered.
So they're learning how to hit the gas pedal on their nervous system and then immediately practicing how to hit the brake.
Yes, they're training their nervous system to bounce back from arousal. And that covers the plasticity tenet of resilience, the ability to adapt to stress and recover.
That makes so much sense.
And it feeds directly into the sociality tenet, too. By engaging in this roughhousing, preschoolers learn how to manage their energy, regulate their aggression, and understand physical boundaries within a social dynamic.
But as the kid gets older, that physical roughhousing has to evolve, right? I mean, you can't just keep tossing a teenager in the air to build resilience.
No, you definitely cannot.
The sources note that in adolescence, this outward-facing dynamic shifts to the meaning tenet. It moves from physical boundary testing to intellectual boundary testing. This is when fathers often engage their kids in the big philosophical questions of life, transferring cultural codes and debating morality.
The physical environment is basically replaced by the mental environment. The caregiver is still pushing the child outward, but now they're pushing them into complex thought. They're modeling how to resolve conflict respectfully and how to navigate the wider society.
I do want to clarify something for you, the listener, who might be looking at modern family dynamics and wondering how this applies today.
Sure.
We're using terms like maternal and paternal, but is this strict outward-facing, chaos-simulating style entirely tethered to gender? What if you have a family with two moms or a household where the dad is the quiet, rhythmic parent and the mom is the one initiating all the rough and tumble play?
That's a crucial question. The function is what matters, not the gender of the person performing it. While evolutionary biology labeled these styles maternal and paternal based on historical norms, this outward-facing limit-testing role is highly flexible. Any benevolent adult or primary caregiver can step into it.
So a mother can absolutely be the one providing that unpredictable, challenge-oriented interaction.
Absolutely. The main takeaway from the neurodevelopmental research is just that a developing child requires both inputs. They need the predictable, soothing, secure base, and they need the unpredictable, outward-facing push into the world.
Which sets up a rather heavy realization.
Yeah.
If that specific type of boundary testing, outward-facing support, is so vital for teaching a child's nervous system how to regulate itself, its absence must be devastating.
It creates a profound developmental void. The psychology sources refer to this as father hunger or the father wound.
Father hunger, wow.
When a child lacks that psychic safe place of strength, someone who encourages them to test their limits while ensuring they won't fall, it leaves an aching hole in their development.
The Psychology Today piece we reviewed actually zeroes in on how this specifically impacts daughters.
Yes, it's very detailed on that.
It details how a father's emotional or physical absence profoundly distorts a daughter's relational life, her creative expression, and her sense of inner authority. And the most tragic part of the mechanism is the internalization. Daughters rarely look at an absent father and think, oh, he has a psychological deficit.
No, children don't think like that.
Instead, they take the burden of his emotional failure as a lack within themselves. They think, if I were smarter or prettier or just better, he would have engaged with me.
And that internalization is the very core of the wound. We also have to remember that absence isn't always physical.
Right, emotional absence.
Exactly. A father might be sitting in the living room every single night. But if he is emotionally walled off, hypercritical, or incapable of validating her emotional life, the daughter experiences that as abandonment.
She's alone in the room with him.
Yes. Her self-confidence is compromised because she redirects her developmental energy. Instead of building her own authentic identity, she spends her formative years trying to perform in a way that might finally fulfill his expectations or fill his emotional emptiness.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Our ancestors actually understood this dynamic perfectly.
They really did.
The sources point out how ancient cultures have embedded this specific psychological pain right into fairy tales. We read these stories to kids, but they operate as psychological survival guides for navigating the emotional wilderness of a failing parent.
Yeah, they're maps.
Take Hansel and Gretel. The father in that story isn't a monster, but he is totally feckless. He is weak.
He is.
He allows the cruel stepmother to dictate the terms. He completely fails to protect his children, and he literally leaves them in the woods to fend for themselves.
It's the archetype of the failed protector. And the research also highlights the grim fairy tale, The Girl Without Hands, which is an even darker exploration of this theme.
Yeah, that one is intense.
It tells the story of a miller who, out of greed and fear, makes a literal deal with the devil. And the result is his daughter's hands being chopped off. It is the ultimate paternal betrayal. He sacrifices her wholeness for his own preservation.
But the narrative isn't just about her suffering, right? It's about her response to the betrayal.
Right.
She leaves his house, she wanders into the wilderness alone, and she undergoes this brutal, self-revelatory journey to eventually grow new hands. She finds her own moral strength and her own inner authority only after accepting that her father cannot and will not protect her.
The fairy tale is modeling the psychological healing process. It acknowledges the maiming of the child's spirit, but it insists that the child has the capacity to regenerate their own agency.
But fairy tales aside, we have to look at the root cause here. Why are these parents absent, abusive, or emotionally walled off in the real world? I mean, they aren't villains in a storybook operating in a vacuum. Hurt people hurt people. And the data we're looking at on generational trauma shows that this isn't just a metaphor.
No, it is an observable, quantifiable cycle. The Mennonite Men article quotes the spiritual writer Richard Rohr, who says, "What we don't transform, we transmit."
What we don't transform, we transmit. That's powerful.
Wounded individuals project their unresolved pain onto their environment, and usually their children are the closest targets. The Suffolk University thesis dives deep into the mechanisms of how systemic historical trauma literally alters parenting styles.
Yeah, the thesis studied Israeli veterans of the 1973 Yom Kippur War.
Right.
Fathers who returned from that conflict suffering from post-traumatic stress symptoms developed what researchers identified as negative world assumptions. Because of what they endured, their baseline view of the world was that it is inherently dangerous, malevolent, and entirely unpredictable.
And they perceived themselves as highly vulnerable within that world.
Oh.
What the researchers found was that these fathers passed that exact worldview down to their offspring.
Even though the kids weren't there.
Exactly. Their children, who never saw combat, exhibited heightened anxiety and a pervasive sense of insecurity, totally mirroring the father's trauma.
Now, this is where I want to dig into the how. Trauma isn't just a bad memory. It acts more like a corrupted line of code in a family's operating system.
That's a good analogy.
If you don't find the bug and rewrite it, every generation that downloads that software is going to crash in the exact same way. But how does a child actually absorb a negative world assumption if the parent never explicitly talks about the war or the trauma? Is it behavioral?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, children are incredibly astute emotional barometers. They do not require a verbal recounting of a traumatic event to feel its echoes.
They just pick up on it.
They observe behavior. A traumatized parent often operates in a state of hypervigilance. The child sees the sudden startled responses to loud noises. They notice the parent scanning exits in a restaurant.
Right.
And more profoundly, they experience the parent's emotional unavailability and physical dissociation.
Dissociation comes up repeatedly in this research, and it's such a quiet mechanism of trauma.
It is.
The parent might be sitting right at the dinner table, physically safe, but their mind is completely checked out. They were staring blankly, trapped in an internal flashback, or simply numbed out to avoid feeling pain.
To a child whose nervous system relies on the parent's engaged presence to feel secure, that psychic absence is terrifying. The protector is offline.
Wow, the protector is offline.
The child internalizes the parent's lack of safety. They absorb the numbness or the sudden, unpredictable outbursts of rage, and they encode that as a fundamental rule about how the world works.
The thesis also explores this through survivors of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia, introducing the phenomenon of role reversal.
Yes, parentification.
Right. Traumatized parents who were subjected to extreme starvation, isolation, and threat often become emotionally helpless later in life. Their trauma overwhelms their capacity to function as the adult in the room, so they start relying on their own children for emotional regulation.
The adult might use guilt to elicit care, or demand the child's constant attention to soothe their own anxiety. They end up treating the child almost like a spouse or a trusted sibling.
Which is so unfair to the kid.
It is.
Yeah.
When a child is forced to provide psychological containment for the adult, the child is robbed of their developmental freedom. They become hyper-responsible and overly anxious, entirely focused on managing the parent's moods rather than exploring their own world. The trauma is directly transmitted through that altered family dynamic.
Man, we have covered a lot of heavy ground here. We've looked at the biological void left by an absent caregiver, the deep wounds that result, and the exact behavioral mechanisms of how trauma is passed from generation to generation.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
Yeah.
But if trauma can be hardwired and transmitted, the research is equally clear that healing can be too.
Absolutely.
How do we actually build that resilience we discussed earlier when our starting point is a deep generational wound?
Healing requires immense intentionality, and the sources heavily emphasize that it requires culturally sensitive, trauma-informed care. You cannot take a standard Western clinical therapy model, drop it into any community, and expect it to magically break multi-generational cycles of systemic pain.
Right. The Suffolk thesis actually highlights how this is working in Indigenous communities in Canada and the U.S. These are populations that have endured profound historical trauma, like the forced removal of children to boarding schools and the systemic destruction of land and language. To heal those deep inherited wounds, they're blending contemporary Western psychological therapy with traditional Indigenous practices.
They are incorporating sweat lodges, sacred songs, storytelling, and perhaps most importantly, the vital presence of elders into the rehabilitation process.
Reconnecting with the roots.
Exactly. This cultural integration does something clinical therapy alone often misses. It restores a severed sense of community and cultural identity. Historical trauma often seeks to destroy a culture's cohesion, therefore the healing must rebuild it.
The research notes similar approaches among second-generation Southeast Asian Americans, too. They are actively combating the inherited trauma of war and displacement by forming community-based support groups and rigorously maintaining their cultural traditions.
It creates a psychological buffer.
Yeah, it gives them a secure base of belonging to counter the stress and isolation of their parents' pasts.
And on an individual level, the Mennonite Men article provides a very grounded framework for this. They outline 7 practical steps for tending to a father wound, or really any deep generational baggage.
Like a roadmap for breaking the cycle.
Exactly. The first step is naming the wound and its source.
Which is often the hardest part because it requires piercing through the denial or the natural tendency to idealize our parents. You have to admit you were hurt by someone who was supposed to protect you.
It's painful. The second step is grieving. You can't just intellectualize the trauma. You have to actually feel the anger and the sadness of what you were denied.
The third step is bringing that pain to a higher power or sharing it with trusted others, which removes the isolation.
Yes. Now, the fourth step is deeply complex, receiving the gifts from the wound.
Finding the silver lining in trauma is a really tough concept, but it means recognizing the empathy, the hyper-awareness, or the sheer resilience that your survival forced you to develop.
The fifth step is forgiving, which the authors define not as excusing the behavior, but as letting go of the pain and the demands you are holding on to.
Following that is the sixth step, embracing your parents with understanding. This involves the realization we discussed earlier that they were not operating in a vacuum. They were likely acting out of their own unhealed trauma and deficits.
And the seventh step is where the cycle actually breaks, extending the love you wish you had received to someone else.
So what does this all mean?
It means you consciously choose to become the benevolent force that was missing in your own life.
Whether you are parenting a child, mentoring someone, or just doing the hard work of reparenting yourself, recognizing your trauma isn't an exercise in blaming your parents. It's about taking the wheel. It's finding the corrupted code and rewriting it so the next generation doesn't crash.
You are transforming the pain so you don't transmit it. And as we wrap up, there is one final concept from the Feldman Lab source material that completely shifts how we view this entire process.
Oh.
We've spent this time discussing neurobiology, psychological frameworks, and cultural healing. But recent computational modeling suggests the very evolution of paternal caregiving might be driven by something happening on a microscopic scale.
Microscopic? Like what?
The microbiome.
Wait, what? So evolutionary biology might have pushed fathers to stick around just so they could act as microbial delivery system.
That is what the models suggest. The theory is that evolution favored highly involved fathers, specifically to create ecological niches, like the close physical contact of grooming, rough and tumble play, and feeding.
Okay.
These close proximity behaviors allow for the transfer of the father's specific microbiome to the offspring. We now understand that a diverse gut microbiome is absolutely vital for a child's immune function and their mental health.
That completely reframes everything.
It really does.
We focus so much on the big picture, the psychological traits, the emotional blueprints, the life lessons we pass down to the kids we raise. But at the most microscopic bacterial level, an involved caregiver is literally sharing their biological ecosystem with the next generation. It makes you realize how deeply, at a cellular and microbial level, we are intertwined with the people who raise us. You might inherit a grandfather clock or a family genetic trait, but you are also walking around with the biological, emotional, and bacterial echoes of the people who held you.
It's incredible to think about.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We highly encourage you to check out the sources we discussed today to explore the nuances of this research on your own. Keep learning, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. For more information or to become a sponsor, please go to our website at www.newberryfilmworks.com. We'll get right back to you. Stay tuned for the next episode, coming up very, very soon.